Good evening. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. Turkey has ended its military campaign in Syria. Operation Euphrates Shield was launched on August 24th last year, securing an area of over 2,000 square kilometers.
The Turkish military completed the Operation Euphrates Shield it had launched in Syria, continuing since August 24, 2016, securing an area of approximately 2,000 square kilometers. Following the National Security Council meeting held in the presidential complex, it has been announced that the Operation Euphrates Shield has been completed. The Council stated that the Euphrates Shield operation launched to secure our country's border security, to prevent ISIS threats and attacks from targeting our country, to give an opportunity to our displaced Syrian brothers to return their homes and to continue their lives in peace and security, has been successfully completed. The Operation Euphrates Shield began on August 24, 2016, with the support of the Turkish military forces to the Free Syrian Army rebels. In the early stages of the operation, the forces took the town Jarablus on the Euphrates River and cleared the ISIS fighters from the border town. In October, the Turkish military forces and the FSA rebels took the town of Dabuk and cleared the Azaz-Jarablus route from ISIS fighters. During the operations, 71 Turkish soldiers were killed. Most of the casualties occurred in the town of Elbab, which was captured by the Turkish military and the FSA rebels after heavy clashes. Following the capture of Elbab, Turkey has been seeking a role for its military in a planned offensive on Raqqa and Manbij. Now it's time for Manbij and Raqqa, President Erdogan had told the journalist on February 12, adding Turkey's interest in working with its allies in Raqqa only if the involvement of YPG was prevented. Shortly after, the US military was deployed to Manbij and the Russian military was deployed to Afrin. It is still unclear whether Turkey will withdraw its troops from northern Syria or not.
The US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson visited Ankara on Thursday. Despite efforts, the two allies were unable to solve disputes.
The US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson completed his first official trip to Turkey since taking office. Despite efforts, the two allies were unable to solve disputes. It's vital for us to give a new energy to the Turkey-US relationships, said Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu during the joint press conference. Indeed, there were multiple sources of tension between the allies to be discussed during the meetings, including the US support given to the YPG, the extradition of Fethullah Gülen, and the recent arrest of the Halkbank executive Mehmet Hakan Atilla. Despite the common goals against ISIS, the tense relations between the two allies had deepened, with the US decision to use Kurdish militia, known as the YPG, within the fight against ISIS. In this period, we expect a better cooperation, said Minister Çavuşoğlu in relation to the issue. Turkey considers the People's Protection Unit, YPG, as a terror group and has been long arguing that the US should cooperate with the Turkish forces in Syria. However, Washington repeatedly argued that the Kurds have been proven themselves to be effective fighters against ISIS. The discussion has, once again, gained importance during the recent days, with the coalition forces preparing for an offensive to retake the city of Raqqa. Despite the efforts, Secretary Tillerson stated that what we discussed today are options that are available to us. They are difficult options. Let me be very frank, it's not easy. Difficult choices have to be made. The status of Fethullah Gülen also remains as a source of tension between the allies. During the joint conference, Minister Çavuşoğlu once again stated that we have submitted all the evidence we have to the previous and current administrations. We have also put forward our demand for temporary detention and extradition.
Our first guest via Skype tonight is Mrs. Ömür Şahin Keyif. She is the Washington, D.C. representative of Daily Bir Gün. Hello, Mrs. Keyif. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yeah, I do.
Hi, thanks for joining us tonight. So, Mrs. Keyif, the deputy CEO of the state-owned Halkbank was arrested in the U.S. on Tuesday after landing at the JFK airport in New York. So, could you briefly summarize what happened exactly and how we should evaluate this?
Yeah. As you know, there's an ongoing legal process about Reza Sarraf in the US. He was accused of violating US's economic sanctions against Iran, bank fraud and money laundering. He is facing 75 years prison term. There were reports about an ongoing broader investigation, and the deputy CEO of Turkish Halkbank, Hakan Atilla, arrived to New York on March 23rd, and he was arrested on his way back home on March 27th. He appeared in court the following day. He is in the same prison with Reza Sarraf right now. On the criminal complaint, he is accused of helping Reza Sarraf use US banks for the transactions that are violating the sanctions. Also, it is stated that he uses his position in the bank to cover the nature of these transactions. The second accusation is bank fraud. Atilla is allegedly worked with Sarraf to create and use false documents. They use these documents to falsely characterize their transactions as food because food is exempt from the sanctions regime. These are serious accusations because, as acting attorney June Kim stated, these sanctions are not recommendations, they are law. A detail from the criminal complaint may be raised. Telephone conversations takes place between Atilla and Sarraf, along with two unnamed co-conspirators. You may see them as CC1 and CC2 in the documents. Criminal complaint described CC2 as supervisor of Atilla. They are talking about the trade from Dubai to Iran and characterizing the nature of these transactions as food on the bills. There may also be consequences for these unnamed people. It's not clear yet. Both Sarraf and Halkbank were in the core of corruption and bribery scandal 2013 in Turkey. And we see that US Attorney's Office and FBI are using the police reports of this scandal. I believe we should wait and see the scope of the investigation on Atilla to talk about the consequences of this legal process. Attila's next trial will be held in Manhattan on 10th of April. Sarraf's and Attila's cases may be joined during this trial. US Attorney Kim in the press release stated that bank fraud carries a maximum 30-year prison term and violating US sanctions carries a maximum 20-year term. So Atilla may face maximum 50 years prison term during the trial.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Keyif.
Thank you.
The City Council of Kirkuk approved a proposal on Tuesday to raise the Kurdish flag over government buildings. The decision sparked harsh criticism from Turkish and Iraqi governments.
The City Council of the oil-rich Iraqi city Kirkuk has approved on Tuesday to raise the Kurdish flag over government buildings. 26 out of 41 members of Kirkuk's council voted for the controversial measure in the absence of Arab and Turkmen representatives. There are 9 Turkmen and 6 Arab representatives in the 41-member Kirkuk Provincial Council. The decision received protests from Turkmen and Arab members of the council, as well as the Turkish and Iraqi governments. Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs released a statement on Tuesday, which noted that the decision is incorrect. The statement said, "We consider this decision, which was endorsed in a vote boycotted by the Turkmen and Arab members of the Provincial Council, as a unilateral act that directly concerns the disputed status of Kirkuk and that contradicts the Iraqi constitution. Insisting on one-sided moves with regard to the status of Kirkuk, which is the common asset of Iraqi citizens of various identities, would undermine reconciliation, dialogue and commitment to the constitutional processes. Such approaches would also be detrimental to the efforts to ensure lasting security and stability in Iraq." Iraqi government has also condemned the decision. Vice President Osama al-Nujayfi described the decision as breach of national unity. The United Nations had also expressed their concerns over such a move. Tens of Turkmens protested on Wednesday in Kirkuk against the decision, deeming the measure as illegal and unilateral. Iraqi Turkmen Front leader Eşref Salihi said raising Kurdish Regional Government KRG flags on official buildings was not legal and that it would lead to chaos. On the other hand, KRG spokesperson Safin Dizai recently gave a statement to Turkish daily newspaper Hürriyet. Dizai said, "We should enter a serious dialogue with Baghdad to reach an amicable solution for divorce. The only way forward is to go for an independent entity in Iraqi Kurdistan. In 2005, Kurdistan gained autonomous governance but is still considered a part of Iraq. The Kurds view Kirkuk as part of any independent state they hope to establish in the future, while Arabs believe that it should remain part of Iraq. There is a Turkmen minority in the province which is considered to be under protection of Turkey. Ankara also insists Kirkuk should be jointly run by Turks, Kurds, and Arabs with a special status and should not be a part of Iraqi Kurdistan.
Despite a widespread consensus in the Turkish public that the July 15th coup attempt was plotted by the Gülen movement, the West remained suspicious. Our following video is a brief chronology of the gradual breakup between the formerly allied AKP and the Gülen movement.
Towards the end of 2000s, the AKP was faced with two choices: to integrate itself to the establishment and to become a centrist party, or to fight with the leading domestic powers, most notably the Turkish military, and challenge the establishment. AKP's choice was the latter, followed by an alliance with the movement of Fethullah Gülen, who was known to have devout supporters within the Turkish bureaucracy. Gülen and his community have been powerful, especially within the social domain, beginning as early as the 1970s, which helped the movement to develop a sphere of influence within the civil society and the state bureaucracy. The first visible political action by this alliance was the launching of a purge named Operation Ergenekon in 2007, with the aim of eliminating the political statu quo in Turkey. This purge was followed by another operation named Balyoz, meaning the sledgehammer, where numerous high-ranking military officials were charged with plotting a coup against the AKP government. An important turning point in the fate of this alliance was the Gaza Flotilla raid of 2010, where the 6 civilian ships headed to break the blockade of Gaza were countered by a military operation by Israel. While Erdogan outspokenly expressed his support for the Gaza Freedom Flotilla, Gülen criticized the government's attitude and its decision to support those who were delivering aid without Israel's consent. Within the scope of Operation Ergenekon, 7 Turkish journalists were arrested in March 2011. Among the arrested journalists were Ahmet Şık, who had been working on a book alleging that the Gülen movement had infiltrated the country's security forces, and Nedim Şener, who was trying to disclose the involvement of the Gülen movement in the assassination of Turkish-Armenian journalist Hrant Dink. The arrest of Şık and Şener was seen as the first cleavage within the alliance, as the Gülen movement showed the signs of following a separate agenda. In February 2012, the alliance started to break up. The conflict became apparent when a special authority prosecutor summoned Hakan Fidan, the head of the National Intelligence Organization, MIT, to testify regarding the talks between the MIT and the Kurdish insurgency group PKK. These events, known as the MIT crisis, have been widely seen as a plot by the Gülen movement and the declaration of war against Erdogan. But the war between Gülenists and the AKP officially started in November 2013. The alliance, which was weakened by the MIT crisis and followed by the Gezi Park protests, finally came to an end after the government's proposal of a new law that would force several private cram schools to shut down. Many of these schools were owned by the Gülenists, and they constituted an important economic and social resource for the movement. On December 17, 2013, Turkey woke up to an unprecedented corruption scandal. Some 50 people, including the sons of 3 cabinet ministers, the head of the state-controlled Halkbank, 3 construction sector tycoons, and an Iranian-Turkish businessman, Rıza Zarrab, were detained on accusations of money laundering, bribery, and fraud. One of the prosecutors involved in the corruption probe was Zekeriya Öz, who had famously headed the Ergenekon case. As a response to the investigation, the government initiated a wave of sackings and reshuffling within the police forces and the judiciary, targeting officials who were believed to be related to the investigation. The Ministry of Interior and Justice quickly changed their regulations, forcing security forces to inform their seniors of their actions at all times. On December 25, a further investigation was initiated for bribery and fraud charges, this time involving the then Prime Minister Erdogan's son. However, the police officers, newly appointed by the government, refused to carry out the prosecutor's orders. The AKP and Prime Minister Erdogan blamed the Gülen movement, which they named as a parallel state, referring to the movement's widespread presence within the state bureaucracy. Erdogan defined the operation as a judiciary coup against the government. After the both cases collapsed, the government initiated a comprehensive operation against the public employees who were suspects of having ties to Gülen, as well as Gülenist businesses and media outlets. Senior leaders of the movement fled the country. In May 2016, Turkey's National Security Council designated the Gülenists as a terrorist organization. Although the Prime Minister and his cabinet found themselves in the midst of a serious corruption scandal, the ruling AKP won the 2014 local elections, increasing its votes from 38% to 42%. In the following year's general elections, the AKP won the majority of the seats in the parliament again with 49% of the votes. July 15, 2016 was an extraordinary day in Turkey's history. Some fractions inside the Turkish military initiated a coup attempt to overthrow the government in the later hours of the evening. Turkish soldiers took to the streets and made a statement on the state TV channel claiming that the military was now in the charge of the country. However, the coup attempt was suppressed before the daybreak. For Erdogan and the AKP, the mastermind behind the coup attempt was clear: Fethullah Gülen. Therefore, the government initiated an unprecedented purge which led to the dismissal, detention or suspension of more than 135,000 state officials who had alleged ties to the Gülen movement. Several radio and TV channels and Gülen-related businesses were also shut down.
Our second guest via Skype tonight is Mr. Nicholas Danforth. He's a senior policy analyst at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Mr. Danforth. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Great to be here.
Thank you for joining. So, Mr. Danforth, the head of the German intelligence organization made a statement last week in which he suggested that they weren't convinced that the Gülen movement was behind the coup attempt of July 15th last year. And a further suspicion was raised in a recent report published by the UK Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. The report was published last Friday, actually. The report said, and I quote, "The investigations into who exactly was responsible for the coup attempt and why are yet to conclude. Witnesses to our inquiry identified 4 categories of those who, in their view, appear to be involved. And these categories include the followers of Fethullah Gülen, Kemalists, and other elements within the military who were either lied to or who sought to preserve their own privileges." So to summarize all of these into a question, why do you think is the West not convinced that the coup attempt was indeed plotted by the Gülen movement?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start. Sorry? So I'm speaking from Washington. That's a little bit of the perspective that I'll be focusing on. But I think some of what I have to say will speak to how the West broadly views this. The statement from the UK that you read, I think that does a very good job of summing up the way a lot of people in Washington who've been following the issue, view this. By and large, there's a general acceptance of the fact that members of the Gülen movement were very much involved in the coup. That's something that even some members of the Gülen movement itself have admitted. Where the skepticism comes in, or where the uncertainty comes in, as you said, is in response to the Turkish government's claim that this was single-handedly orchestrated and carried out in its entirety by Fethullah Gülen and the movement. And that's where, Washington continues to have its uncertainties, and for the specific issue of extradition, which is obviously on everyone's mind, those uncertainties become very important. So I guess what I'd say is, in terms of why that's the case, it's a little difficult for any of us to evaluate, not knowing what specific evidence the Turkish government has given to the United States. As best any of us can tell from what, statements that, it seems pretty clear from statements that members of the United States government who've seen that evidence have said they are, profoundly unconvinced. Why that could be, this puts us, again, not having seen the evidence, in a position of speculating a little bit, but I guess I'd give a handful of reasons. The first would be that I think the whole issue got off to a very bad start. I think there was a lot of frustration in the United States that immediately after the coup, the Turkish government was demanding that the United States extradite Gülen, was angry at the United States for not having extradited Gülen, was accusing the United States of conspiratorial involvement in the coup before it had even handed over any of the evidence about the coup. And then that discrepancy was replicated. There was a couple months later, the Turkish government was again angry at the United States for not having put Gülen in pretrial detention. It then came out that they hadn't submitted the official paperwork to request that he be put in pretrial detention. So there was frustration in the United States about that. I think there was also frustration in that no one, at least in the kind of initial statements coming out from Turkey after the coup, seemed terribly concerned with the fact that in the United States there was a fairly clear legal bar for what evidence was necessary for Gülen to be extradited, and that it had to not just show that people in the movement were involved in the coup, but had to link that specifically to Gülen himself, since he was the person whose extradition was requested. And so that, when people in Turkey made it seem like this was a purely political decision, when if America really cared about Turkey, if America really cared about the U.S.-Turkish relationship, if we sympathized with what Turkey had been through, we just go ahead and extradite Gülen, evidence be damned. That rubbed a lot of people in Washington the wrong way. Mm-hmm. And then I guess more broadly, the final point I'd make is that connected to the certainty and kind of fervor with which the Turkish government has presented its case, its insistence from day one that, obviously Gülen was behind this, and anyone who didn't believe that was either naive or an enemy of Turkey. The fact they insisted on this so strongly when so much of the evidence was changing, did seem uncertain, when there were so many big questions that had were left unanswered, that I think made people in the United States suspicious. And when evidence started coming out, that clearly seemed to have been, confessions that had been obtained under coercion, under torture, when this was mixed in with the other evidence that the government was given, when sort of clearly outrageous claims were made linking enemies of the government to the Gülen movement, which seemed purely opportunistic, when the scope of the purges, when the number of people accused of participation in the coup grew to such wildly inflated numbers, this all increased what I think was originally just a kind of initial skepticism that gradually grew into suspicion. Mm-hmm. And so that, I think there are still very much people in Washington who, again, are open to the idea that maybe, this will turn out to have been orchestrated by Gülen. They're still waiting to see the evidence, and when they're, I think many people here see as a healthy skepticism, a desire to see the evidence before they make a decision, is treated as, again, a form of hostility towards Turkey. That makes them frustrated, and that frustration makes it harder to have the kind of rational conversation between well-meaning allies that we would hope to.
Mm-hmm. So, thank you. That was a very concise explanation. My follow-up question would be that the Western suspicion comes in spite of the majority of the Turkish public, regardless of whether they're pro or anti-Erdogan, fully convinced that the Gülen movement was most probably behind the coup attempt. So do you think this is not being seen by the Western public, or let me ask it this way, is the Western public not aware of this?
Yeah, certainly the Western public who's paying attention is aware of it. Certainly, Turkish journalists, representatives of the Turkish government have done a very good job making them aware of it. I guess you could turn the question around and say, is the Turkish public aware of the fact that everyone outside of Turkey, for the most part, continues to harbor, grave doubts about their government's version of the story, about their government's insistence that it was Gülen alone who carried out this coup? I don't know.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Danforth, for joining us tonight.
Well, could I maybe make one more...
Sure.
One more follow-up.
Sure.
Since this is something that, at least when I've had these conversations with other people in Turkey, they've been very interested in talking about, and that's kind of why, I mean, maybe following up on your question, why the Turkish government hasn't been more effective in making its case publicly in the United States. And that's where, being in Washington, having seen delegations that come from Turkey talking about this, it's something I've been very attuned to. People in Turkey are aware the Gülen movement is obviously very active in Washington. They've done a very good job at kind of public outreach and public relations. And what I've been really struck by, I think this goes back to what I was saying, is I think one of the reasons that the Gülen movement has been, up until now, so effective in its public relations in Washington is that, given this dynamic, it's been able to capitalize on the doubts that people have about the Turkish government's version of the story, whereas the Turkish government, by insisting so fervently, again, on one version of the story and refusing to even entertain any doubts, has made their position seem less credible. And so they are, the only people that the Turkish government will send to speak in Washington are people who endorse its version of events 100%. I've heard people say, someone said, if they sent Ahmet to Washington instead of putting him in jail, he might have done a good job convincing people in D.C. Gülenists were involved. He might have convinced them of some other stuff the government wouldn't have liked. But, he would have made that aspect, he would have made that part of the case effectively. The Turkish government hasn't kind of given its representatives the freedom to be critical of the Turkish government's line, to speak out and say, all right, we know Gülenists were involved, but maybe these purges are going overboard. And if there were people kind of defending the Turkish government who were able to say things like that, I think they'd come across as much more credible to a Washington audience. And what they're up against, unfortunately, is people in the Gülen movement who I think have been very good at crafting a message that appeals to people in Washington. They meet reality halfway in their lobbying efforts instead of working against it. And so what you get when you talk to members of the Gülen movement, they don't try to make it about Fethullah Gülen. They don't try to defend Fethullah Gülen. As I said, sometimes they admit that members of the movement might have been involved in the coup. But what they do is they focus on issues of due process. They focus on, the need for evidence. They focus on, the abuses, the authoritarian behavior that Erdogan has been engaged in. And these are messages, they contain an element of truth in a way that people in Washington pick up on, and it speaks to the doubts, it speaks to the suspicions, it speaks to the concerns that people in Washington have about Turkey. Whereas the Turkish government's message, I think by being so heavy-handed sometimes, unfortunately has the effect, even for people who are sympathetic to everything the Turkish government's been through, of rubbing them the wrong way and raising their doubts about the way all of this is being handled in Turkey.
Thank you. So what I take from your response is that the Turkish government seems to be losing the PR game with the jailed journalists and other imprisoned public intellectuals. Thank you very much, Mr. Danforth, for your comments and for joining us tonight.
A pleasure. A pleasure.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon.
The countdown for the 36th Istanbul Film Festival has begun. Organized by the Istanbul Foundation for Culture and Arts, İKSV, the festival will be on between the 5th and the 15th of April.
The 36th Istanbul Film Festival, organized by the Istanbul Foundation for Culture and Arts, İKSV, and recognized as a specialized competitive event by the FIAPF, will take place between the 5th and 15th of April. In his opening speech, Görgün Taner, the director of İKSV, said that this year the festival will offer 1 lira tickets to students for more screenings in order to attract a younger audience. From the 5th until the 15th of April, cinema lovers will meet in different cinemas in the city. Beyoğlu Sineması and Atlas Sineması in Beyoğlu, Pera Museum Auditorium, Italian Culture Institute in Beyoğlu, Cinemaximum Canyon, Zorlu Center Cinemaximum, Kadıköy Rex, and City Cinemaximum in Nişantaşı to watch these selected films. The opening ceremony will take place on Tuesday, the 4th of April at the Tim Maslak Show Center.
Now let's have a look at what's on in Istanbul this week.
You can spend your Friday night at Bomontia'da this week. A screening of a documentary titled Nublu Music Now, directed by Sercan Sezgin, will take place at Bomontia'da tonight at 9:30 on the 4th floor. Nublu Music Now is an impressionistic documentary about an underground jazz club in New York City's Lower East Side, founded and run by İlhan Şahin. After watching the Nublu documentary, you can enjoy a concert by Turkish saxophonist İlhan Şahin and DJ Ocean vs. Orientalist at Babylon Bomonti. İlhan Şahin is known as a global jazz ambassador and owns the Nublu jazz clubs in New York, Sao Paulo and Istanbul. Ocean vs. Orientalist, founded by Şafak Özkütle, is a collective which aims to challenge the existing aesthetic perceptions in electronic music. The duo will be hitting up Babylon tonight. The 6th Istanbul International Dance Festival, which is considered to be one of the best Latin dance festivals in the world, and which gathers more than 3,500 dancers from a total of 80 countries, will be held between the 29th of March and the 3rd of April. The event has already kicked off yesterday with a welcome party, and will be on until the 3rd of April. During the festival, participants will have the opportunity to join in various workshops, training camps, parties, live concerts, and to see amazing performances by world-renowned dance artists and performing groups from the United States, Canada, South America, Europe, Ukraine, and Russia. The performances will take place at the Hilton Bosphorus. The Pera Museum will host a series of performances titled Look Again between the 31st of March and the 2nd of April. In collaboration with Perform Istanbul, inspired by the exhibitions of the museum's collection, the program features performances by several artists including Aslı Emki, Ekim Bernay, and Ata Doğruer.
That's all for this week. Thank you for tuning in and hope to see you again next Friday at 9 p.m. Bye.